poppin', Watchmen? It's me, MT, and welcome back to the Heavy Spoiler Show. This is a breakdown of the 3.5-hour ultimate cut of Zack Snyder's Watchmen. This big boy is a brutal beast of a blast, and I cannot wait to get into it with you all today, so I won't. So much like the comedian did with the pavement, let's just dive into it. The Watchmen movie, of course, is an adaptation of Alan Moore's 1986 comic book series set in the Cold War era of an alternate universe of crime-fighting vigilantes. And because of the Cold War setting, World War III is a threat consuming the minds of absolutely everyone. This being the case, I love how the movie starts with a zoom out from the comedian's smiley face pin, accompanied by the sound of a tea kettle screeching. Having this occur as the comedian listens to a TV broadcast detailing the rising tensions between Russia and Afghanistan was a fantastic audible choice by Zack Snyder to set up this universe of boiling tension between the nations of the world on the brink of a possible nuclear Armageddon. And though not mentioned directly, the program that Eddie Blake is watching is actually Snyder's recreation of the McLaughlin Group, a popular political discussion and debate show hosted by John McLaughlin that ran from 1962 until John McLaughlin's death in 2016. In Watchmen, actor Gary Houston plays the host John McLaughlin, Mary Ann Berger steps into the shoes of prominent real-life political reporter Eleanor Clift, and James Conner plays the role of conservative political commentator and politician Pat Buchanan. In that television broadcast, we can see a watchdog group of nuclear scientists move the doomsday clock to 5 minutes to midnight, which is coincidentally the time shown in the production studio booth, as we can see the broadcast is being recorded at 11:55. As the comedian watches the broadcast, we can see that he has a gun lying on top of a Hustler magazine, which I found to be the perfect choice to summarize the personality of the comedian right when we first are introduced to him, because the comedian's love of fulfilling his lustful desires is only outweighed by his love of gun violence and murder. Since the comedian is supposed to be a living parody of America's debauchery and brutality, this symbolism makes perfect sense. But having a gun at the ready while watching TV also serves to show the fear and paranoia the comedian had for all the evil actions of his life catching up to him one day, as his long career as an unethical government-sanctioned soldier of war has caused this dude to garner a shitload of enemies, which is why the comedian is not entirely surprised by his assassin's entrance. Well, that and his discovery of what his attacker Ozymandias was truly up to. When the comedian throws his mug at his attacker, we get a slow motion shot of the mug hitting his apartment door with the number 3001 on it. However, when the mug smashes against the door, the number 1 at the end of 3001 is covered by the mug's shadow, making the number look like 300, which was, of course, the name of Zack Snyder's hit film that Snyder made before shooting Watchmen. However, this isn't the only reference to 300 in Watchmen, because towards the end of the movie, when New York is about to get their new radioactive crater installed, we can see the number 300 on the lock of Rorschach's prison psychiatrist's suitcase full of Rorschach tests. Zack Snyder's 300, of course, starred Gerard Butler as the lead role, an actor who returns in Snyder's ultimate cut of Watchmen as the captain in the Tales of the Black Friar animated adaptation of the in-universe comic of the same name. Butler was originally going to play that role in live action, but the expensive nature of the shoot led to those $20 million sequences being cut. But more on Tales of the Black Friar later, because although this pirate story might seem completely random and out of place for both the Watchmen comic and movie, the meaning behind this comic goes hand in hand with the overall story. Anyways, as the comedian and Ozymandias fight, you can see that these two dudes have a degree of super strength about them, as the comedian is able to punch through walls, while Ozymandias is able to throw the comedian around like it's nothing. Though the Watchmen Ultimate Cut movie is a super close recreation of the original comic, giving some of the Watchmen a degree of super strength is one of the major changes Snyder made to his adaptation. Both the comedian and Ozymandias are normal non-powered heroes in the comics, so a lot of fans were pretty upset when they first noticed these superpowers, as it very much lessens the impact of the arrival of the superpowered Dr. Manhattan to the world, as Dr. Manhattan was Earth's first and only superpowered hero in that comic. In the original book, John Osterman's transformation into the nigh-omnipotent Dr. Manhattan made non-superpowered crime fighters feel obsolete. Much like Einstein's scientific discovery that time was relative made John Osterman's watchmaker of a father feel obsolete in his profession. So obsolete, in fact, that he threw his watchmaking equipment off of a balcony and quit being a watchmaker altogether as soon as he found out, right before encouraging his son John to follow in Einstein's footsteps rather than his own. And this is why I believe Alan Moore calling this comic about obsolete heroes the Watchmen was so perfectly reflective of Dr. Manhattan's watchmaker father. So having superpowered Watchmen in this movie adaptation sort of takes away from that specific impact of Dr. Manhattan's arrival on the crime-fighting community. But that's just me. But anyways, as the two fight, the comedian crashes into a pinup of his former Minutemen colleague, Sally Jupiter, which very much points to his obsession with her. Later on, when we get a flashback of the comedian burning Ozymandias'S map of the nation, we can see that the comedian uses a Sally Jupiter lighter to do so. So this dude has been Sally's biggest and creepiest fan for a long while now. A fan finally getting the sweet karma he deserves at the hand of Ozymandias for forcing himself on Sally all those years ago. Rest in pavement, you son of a bitch. Then, when Ozymandias is about to throw the comedian out the window, the comedian laughs and says, "It's a joke, it's all a joke, mother forgive me." Then blood from the comedian's smile drips onto his smiley face pin to form the legendary piece of Watchmen iconography. Having blood drip from the comedian's smile to form a bloody tear on his smiley face pin is a perfect symbolic summary of the comedian's whole lifestyle of laughing through the pain of existing in a chaotic world ruled by self-righteous, hypocritical men. An internal pain that he shows most prominently when he drunkenly stumbles into his best frenemy Moloch's apartment later on in the story, where the comedian says, "Mother forgive me," again after cryptically crying while confessing his crimes to a career criminal with cancer. Anyways, after the comedian takes a tumble down onto the streets to Unforgettable by Nat King Cole, the movie switches the soundtrack up and plays The Times They Are A-Changin' by Bob Dylan during a montage of how the times have changed since the start of vigilantism. First, we can see imagery of Hollis Mason, the original Night Owl, punching a gunman in front of the Gotham Opera House, as a well-dressed man, a woman in a pearl necklace, and their butler look on. This is of course a reference to Thomas and Martha Wayne's assassination from the Batman comics, an assassination that the original Night Owl stops to prevent the tragic origin of Batman in this universe. We can even see that Zack Snyder snuck in some posters of 1940s Batman #1 behind Night Owl to really drive that Batman reference home. Then, when the title card of the movie comes up, we get an extremely faithful recreation of the Minutemen group photo that was originally included in Alan Moore's Watchmen comic. The Minutemen were, of course, America's first ever coming together of mass vigilantes. According to Hollis Mason in his book, Under the Hood, that detailed his own career as well as the rise and fall of American vigilantes, Mason was inspired to become the crime fighter Night Owl ever since America's first vigilante, Hooded Justice, started making a difference on the streets and massive waves in the media, with the two later joining forces with the Minutemen. From left to right in the photograph, we have Ursula Zahnt's silhouette, who unfortunately ends up being murdered for being in a lesbian relationship, Brian Lewis, the Mothman, who ends up getting sent off to Sunnycrest Asylum after developing a major mental illness on top of a serious drinking problem after the pressures of crime fighting get to him, Bill Brady's Dollar Bill, the superhero mascot for a department store, whose corpse we see after he gets shot at point-blank range after his cape got caught in a revolving door. Edna Mode was onto something. No capes. No capes. Hollis Mason's Night Owl, who we see get beaten to death by the Not Tops gang later on in the film, Captain Metropolis, who ends up being the one to assemble the Minutemen, ends up being decapitated by a car accident in the comics. Then we have the first Silk Spectre, Sally Jupiter, who is Laurie's mom, Hooded Justice, the world's first vigilante, whose true identity is never revealed before he disappears without a trace following the outlawing of crime fighting, with Eddie Blakes the comedian in his old yellow boiler suit kneeling in front of them all. Then, a little later during this montage, after we see yet another one of Sally Jupiter's pinup art on the Enola Gay bomber plane that just bombed Hiroshima, Japan, we can see famous photographer Alfred Ernstadt taking this universe's version of the iconic VJ Day in Times Square photo marking America's victory over Japan, with the hero silhouette filling in for the male soldier in the original photograph. And unfortunately, because this lesbian kiss was done during the massively intolerant time of 1945, you can see a group of stupid judgmental bitches grimacing in the background as they kiss. It is this type of hateful, homophobic mentality that would end up getting Silhouette and her partner killed in bed while reading a news article about their sexcapades. Then a little later, during Sally Jupiter's retirement party, we can see Zack Snyder have the Minutemen recreate Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, which is fitting considering that this would be the last supper of the Minutemen as a bunch of these team members are about to be taken out of the picture. And after that, we can see President John F. Kennedy shaking the blue hand of Dr. Manhattan before getting brutally assassinated by the comedian, an event that Dr. Manhattan actually foresaw well before he met JFK in the comics. comics. In this scenario, the comedian is of course the badge man from the conspiracy that hypothesizes that there was a second shooter with a bright badge on his chest that shot JFK from a grassy knoll. But in the Watchmen universe, that bright badge was actually the comedian's smiley face pin. And as Sally Jupiter has a fight with her husband in front of a young Laurie about her sleeping with the comedian, we can see a news report showing the deadly protest of Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc, who died on June 11th, 1963, after lighting himself on fire on the streets of Saigon in protest of the inhumane religious intolerance of the South Vietnamese government. Shout out to our editor Matthew for catching this one. But on top of this television set, we can see that Zack Snyder made sure to include the snow globe that Laurie ends up staring into to drown out her parents shouting in the comics. Then after this, we can see Rorschach's calling card that he leaves next to two badly beaten up criminals that Rorschach tied to a fire hydrant, with the symbol on the piece of paper, of course, being Rorschach's drawing of a Rorschach test, which was a form of psychological test invented by Swiss psychoanalyst Hermann Rorschach in 1921 that involved using symmetrical ink blots on patients and recording their associative responses, which is what the crime fighter Rorschach bases his mask on. I particularly love how the villains Rorschach beats up are lying there in the same double L shape that Rorschach leaves behind on his Rorschach test calling card, with the dots being their heads and the L's being their bodies lying back to back against the fire hydrant. Nice little subtle symbolism there by Zack Snyder. Then, after we see Cuban leaders Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union's Leonid Brezhnev look over their stockpile of nuclear missiles that fueled the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, we can see images of what appears to be the March on the Pentagon protest of October 1st, 1967, as we can see imagery of a woman putting a flower inside of a rifle, which is a reference to Bernie Boston's iconic flower power photograph taken at that protest march. A march that had no fatalities in real life, but ended up being a lot more deadly in the Watchmen universe. Then after this, we can see iconic artist maestro Andy Warhol in an art gallery showing off his new Night Owl pop art to the world. But if you look behind him, you can also see a Rorschach ink blot exhibit as well, suggesting that Warhol is a massive fan of crime-fighting heroes in this universe. But this is before we see footage of Neil Armstrong's moon landing and hear Armstrong saying, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski," as he stares at Dr. Manhattan on the surface of the moon, which is a reference to an urban legend that states that Neil Armstrong, after he said his iconic "one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," also uttered the cryptic sentence, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." And while people were trying to figure out who this mysterious Mr. Gorski was, someone came up with a ridiculous story of Mr. Gorski being one of Neil Armstrong's childhood neighbors who he overheard asking for a blowy from Mrs. Gorski, to which Mrs. Gorski apparently replied, "Oral sex? I'll give you oral sex when the kid next door walks on the moon," which is what Neil Armstrong does. However, both the Gorskis and Neil Armstrong's "Good luck, Mr. Gorski" are both urban legends that never actually happened in real life. But it's still super fun to see Zack Snyder include that reference here. Then, after we see Ozymandias stand for photos in front of Studio 54, we can see him walk up to David Bowie, Mick Jagger, and the Village People. Then right after this, we can see the Watchmen team taking a group photo in front of the photos of their Minutemen predecessors. In the comics, this team isn't called the Watchmen like it is in the movie, but instead the Crime Busters. The term Watchmen is never actually used to refer to the crime busters in the comics, but is instead a reference to the famous Roman poet Juvenal when he wrote "Quis custodiet espos custodies." I don't know Latin, so I probably ruined that terribly, but it roughly translates into "who will guard the guards themselves," and then later, "who watches the watchman," which is a phrase that we can see graffitied on that television storefront at the start of the film, and just graffitied in different places throughout the movie. Zack Snyder would later go on to leave this Latin phrase on a nearby wall during Batman and Superman's fight in Batman v Superman as a direct reference to his Watchmen movie. But anyways, as the Watchmen pose for the photograph, Laurie, the new Silk Spectre, is positioned in between her father, the comedian, and a photograph of her mother, Sally Jupiter. Dr. Manhattan and Ozymandias are framed within the American flag behind them, foreshadowing their future collaboration, and Dan Dreiberg's Night Owl is positioned right in front of Hollis Mason's original Night Owl. Then we can see through the windows of a television store that presidential term limits have been repealed, allowing President Nixon to clinch himself more terms in office while also outlawing unsanctioned vigilantes. We can also see a broadcast of the Doomsday Clock being set to 5 minutes to midnight before nearby protesters are engulfed by the flames of a Molotov cocktail thrown thrown at the television store window, very much meant to symbolize the nuclear flames of Armageddon that threatened the entire world during this Cold War setting. Then, as the camera zooms out from the street cleaner washing the comedian's blood from the pavement, up to the detectives in the comedian's apartment, we can actually see Rorschach as his alter ego Walter Kovacs without his mask, holding a sign that says "The end is nigh," likely analyzing the point of impact right before he makes his way into the apartment. These two detectives in the comedian's apartment are actually the first characters that speak in the original Watchmen comic, and much of their dialogue is actually ripped straight from those opening pages. And during a quick zoom out from these detectives, we can actually see a blimp floating over the city that says Gunga Diner. Gunga Diner is actually the diner that Dan and Laurie end up having a date in later on in the film. Then, right before Rorschach picks up the comedian's pen and starts his extremely comic book accurate monologue, a newspaper flies onto the street that has a pale horse headline on one page and a doomsday clock at 5 to midnight headline on the other. Pale Horse is the name of a famous death metal band in this universe that actually performs on the night that Ozymandias attacks the world in the comic. This is super fitting considering that Pale Horse is also a direct reference to Death, one of the horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelations chapter 6, verse 8. As Rorschach goes through the comedian's apartment, we can see him pick up a newspaper article of the comedian's takedown of the notorious villain, the Italian Shadow, a famous Italian assassin brutally taken out by the comedian's less than restrained fighting style. Then Rorschach finds another newspaper article that details how the comedian took down and arrested Moloch back in February 1970. But anyways, after Rorschach ditches the scene of the crime, we meet both versions of Night Owl in the form of the old Hollis Mason, played by Stephen McHattie, and the current Night Owl, played by Patrick Wilson in his first DC Comics role before playing the villainous Ocean Master in the first Aquaman movie. On Mason's desk, we can see a photograph of his days as a police officer, along with some toy cars and books on cars, representing his love of repairing automobiles in his youth and in his retirement. We can also see copies of his book Under the Hood, which details how Mason became one of the first superheroes in the world as Night Owl, as well as the rise and fall of America's first superhero team, the Minutemen. The Ultimate Cut of Watchmen also includes a Under the Hood documentary detailing these behind-the-scenes details of the Golden Age Minutemen. It's a super great documentary and I highly recommend it. We can also see the walls in Hollis Mason's house covered with owl decor, before we get a shot of Mason's TV showing a news broadcast detailing the Keene Act, which was the law signed by Nixon to make vigilante heroism illegal. You know, much like we saw in movies like The Incredibles or Captain America Civil War. During that shot of the TV, we can see a book on the side called Equation for Evil by Philip Caputo, which was a detective story surrounding a horrific hate crime that was actually published in 1996 in our reality. So since Watchmen takes place in the 80s, Hollis Mason couldn't possibly have owned that book. However, the Watchmen movie is not afraid to throw a timeline-breaking book or two in the background, as later on in the film, right before Laurie accidentally sets Night Owl's basement on fire, you can actually see a copy of the Watchmen #7 comic on Dan Dreiberg's desk, which is the very comic where Laurie accidentally sets Night Owl's basement on fire. I find it super hilarious how the Watchmen comic technically already exists in this movie universe, because Dan should have seen all of this chaos in his life coming. And this comic is right next to a picture of the Twilight Lady, who was a villain Night Owl put away a long time ago that had a deep attraction to Night Owl. So much so that she sent him a picture of herself, their dynamic very much mirroring Batman and Catwoman. But anyways, after Dan finds that Rorschach has broken into his apartment for all of his sweet, sweet beans, they head to Night Owl's basement lair, where we can see both Night Owl's regular and Arctic Night Owl suits on display in a glass case. Towards the end of their conversation, Rorschach angrily refers to President Richard Nixon as Tricky Dick, which was the derogatory name Nixon's political opponents started to call him during his run for Senate in California in 1950. And seeing that Nixon is on his 5th term as president in this story, some would argue that that Dick was tricky indeed. We then get a shot of Night Owl's crescent moon-shaped throwing knives, which of course are extremely reminiscent to those of Marvel's Moon Knight. Which then leads us to our first piece of the animated Tales of the Blackfriar pirate comic series being read by Bernie at his buddy Bernard's newsstand. This tragic pirate adventure comic being told alongside the original Watchmen story was writer Alan Moore's way of showing how the comic book medium oftentimes reflects what's going on in real life. Because much like Watchmen antagonist Ozymandias' main mission of saving the world from nuclear Armageddon had the dark foundations of countless dead bodies, many of whom were his former colleagues, The captain in Tales of the Black Friar mirrors that by building a boat of dead bodies in order to head back home and save his family from the pirates of the Black Friar who killed all of his crew. However, after drinking so much seawater while sailing on this boat of dead men for so long, the captain loses his touch on reality completely, as his fear of what the Black Friar could do to his family warps him from being a rational thinking good man into a fearful beast of a savage. And that mindset is how the captain ends up savagely beating his wife to death after his warped mind mistook her for a Black Friar pirate. World War III was Ozymandias's Black Friar, and his fear of World War III warped his mind so completely that he was willing to give a bunch of people cancer, as well as kill the comedian, Moloch, millions of human beings, and finally Rorschach, just to prevent his fear from possibly becoming a reality. Rorschach is even represented in the Black Friar story as the captain's bloody sails, as the bloodstains on this sail constantly change their appearance to look like bloody symmetrical Rorschach tests, much like the remains of Rorschach's body looked like after Dr. Manhattan popped all the human being juice out of his body, just so Ozymandias can keep his dark secret. But anyways, after that animation ends, we see Bernie reading the Tales of the Black Friar comic with a poster of the comic behind him that shows us that the comic is published by DC Comics in this reality, much like the original Watchmen comics were. We can also see a poster for the Pale Horse Band behind Rorschach as he waits for his newspaper. Then the movie fittingly transitions from the Black Friar sequence directly to Ozymandias'S Office, where Dan Dreiberg picks up a Time magazine cover with Ozymandias shaking the hand of Dr. Manhattan, with the cover of the New Yorker right behind that having an artist's recreation of that very same handshake. We can see that Adrian has also had appearances in both Forbes and The Economist as well. But one particular thing of note about this scene is that in the comics, it's not Night Owl that visits Ozymandias to warn him of a hero killer, but Rorschach himself. And rather than admiring Ozymandias' action figures of the Watchmen like Night Owl does, Rorschach condemns Ozymandias for making toy soldiers of himself. And though Rorschach doesn't appear in this scene, you can actually see Rorschach with his human face and the end is nigh sign spying on Dan and Lori during their first date, and then later on at the comedian's funeral studying the attendees. And later, while Ozymandias watches Eddie Blake get buried, we get a flashback to his most prominent memory of the comedian when Eddie Blake burns his crime map, as the comedian, laughing at the futility of the Watchmen's efforts to save the world in the face of Armageddon, is likely what first sparked Ozymandias' deep fear of World War III. However, if we actually look at this crime map, we can see that the Watchmen weren't exactly the best crime fighters in the world, as sexual promiscuity, black unrest, and anti-war demonstrations were some things high on their priority list for policing. And speaking of anti-war demonstrations, Night Owl's most prominent memory of the comedian plays out in the form of the two heroes arriving to an anti-Vietnam War demonstration that they were tasked to break up. The two arrive in Night Owl's owl-themed combat plane that he nicknamed Archie after the fictional Merlin's pet owl Archimedes. And choosing I'm Your Boogeyman by KC and the Sunshine Band for this scene was a fantastic choice by Snyder, as the comedian was very much a boogeyman type figure to a lot of people on the other side of his guns. And while the comedian is firing on the protesters, he tells Night Owl that he hasn't had this much fun since Woodward and Bernstein, which heavily implies that the comedian was involved with the assassinations of political reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in this universe, two people who were instrumental in exposing Richard Nixon in the Watergate scandal. So Richard Nixon's re-election is likely due to the comedian keeping the Watergate scandal out of the papers. And in the comics, the comedian jokingly says that he had nothing to do with Woodward and Bernstein's death, but for nobody to ask him where he was during Kennedy's assassination, which is kind of hilarious considering what he does to JFK in the movie's opening. That dude killed all three of those motherfuckers. Then when the comedian shoots someone for spraying Who Watches the Watchmen on a nearby wall with an American flag, you can see that the words on the wall seem to read, "America welcomes Vietnam as our 51st state," pointing to America's colonization of Vietnam after winning the war. But anyways, when Rorschach goes to interrogate Moloch at his apartment, you can see some playing cards in a drawer that Rorschach opens. This is a reference to Moloch being a magician-themed villain back in the day. And more playing cards can be seen on the walls outside of Moloch's apartment later on in the film when Rorschach is being wrongfully arrested for his murder. Then, after Laurie has her surprise threesome with Dr. Manhattan, only to find out that he was cheating on her with science, that fucking nerd, we can see Dr. Manhattan working with Adrian Veidt on his subatomic quantum unified intrinsic field device that Adrian would ultimately end up repurposing to frame Dr. Manhattan for the deaths of millions of people at the end of the film. This is one of the biggest changes Zack Snyder made from the original source material, as comic book Ozymandias actually genetically engineers a giant psychic squid to attack the world in order to force an end to the Cold War instead of using these Dr. Manhattan bombs. However, Zack Snyder made sure to make the acronym for Ozymandias' subatomic quantum unified intrinsic field device to be SQUID, as a nod to the book's original ending. Then later, we can see Dr. Manhattan being interviewed by Ted Koppel, a real-life broadcast journalist being portrayed by actor Ron Fassler in the movie. However, that interview quickly heads south fast, forcing Dr. Manhattan to fuck off to Mars, something that President Richard Nixon and his right-hand man, Henry Kissinger, are forced to address as the doomsday clock moves towards 2 minutes to midnight. And a little after this, that same giant blimp from before advertising Gunga Diner floats right outside Adrian's office prior to his staged attack, followed directly by that Gunga dinner date between Laurie and Dan that I mentioned before. Then, as Dan and Laurie leave the diner, one of Ozymandias' Pyramid Transnational trucks can be seen driving down the street. Then later, when we get the flashback of Rorschach butchering that child killer to death, I couldn't help but notice that this moment goes significantly different in the book, with Rorschach instead opting to handcuff the killer to a furnace and burning his house down, while offering the killer a saw to cut his arm off if he wanted to escape the flames, which he doesn't. And speaking of Rorschach and arms getting cut off, that moment where Big Figure cuts one of his goons' arms off to get to Rorschach in his cell didn't actually happen in the source material, as Big Figure ends up telling one of his other goons to cut Lawrence's throat instead. And rather than using a saw to cut the bars like the goons do in the movie, Big Figure actually uses a blowtorch in the comic, which is why Big Figure says that he wants to smell Rorschach cooking. That line doesn't really work as well in the movie because there's no blowtorch. And a little later, when the Knot Tops gang plan to kill Hollis Mason at Bernard's newsstand, we can see a billboard for Meltdowns, a popular candy produced by Veidt Industries themed after the nuclear tensions of the Cold War. Anything to make money, right? And while we're on the subject of Adrian Veidt, when Night Owl and Rorschach break into Ozymandias' office to search through his business files, Night Owl comes across a folder on a floppy disk that just says "Boys" on it. If Rorschach was the one on the computer instead of Night Owl, his suspicions of Ozymandias being gay would likely be confirmed to him. And towards the end of the film, when Night Owl and Rorschach are approaching the nefarious fake Pharaoh's fortress, Ozymandias can be seen watching them on his wall of TV screens. And some of the other things that Ozymandias is watching on that wall include The Day the Earth Stood Still, a Marvin the Martian cartoon, Rambo, Failsafe, The Road Warrior, and the original 300 Spartans movie from 1962, another allusion to Snyder's 300 movie. And finally, seconds before Ozymandias' bomb detonates on New York, we can see Rorschach's psychiatrist's watch freeze at 10 seconds to midnight, both symbolizing how close all the people in New York were to their annihilation, as well as how close the world was towards total nuclear destruction. But that is it for this breakdown of the ultimate cut of Watchmen. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. You can follow me at Mastertainment on Twitter and Instagram and anywhere I am on the social medias if you guys want to see me post some weird shit. But most importantly, do not forget to subscribe to Heavy Spoilers here on YouTube. We got some really fun stuff planned for you guys in the future, so do not miss any of it. Click that bell, or I will yell. Just kidding, I won't yell, but I'll be very disappointed if you don't. Just kidding, do what you want. I love you guys so much, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.